How do I connect with you today? How are we doing this work as creators together? How does this creative community, all of us in the room today, how do we connect with one another? And what is our collective journey? I think that much of the journey is simply our shared evolutionary impulse, something that's within us that says create, solve, heal, foster, nurture, repair, and enliven the human spirit. What I hope to do today is to give you some cairns, some little markers that are scraps of my work as a creator across so many disciplines, the archaeology of my experience, if you will, as a creator. And when I say creator instead of artist, it's because what I've observed is that while the tools and the materials change, the creative process stays the same. All I really have to offer today are some questions about the ways you respond creatively to the things that matter to us. How do our creative responses in the world around us emerge? And how do we expand our work outside the boundaries of our colonized minds? And I'll explain what I mean by colonized minds in just a moment. And I hope you're okay that I show you a lot of images. There are a lot of images. I ask you to see this as a time poem, and that each of these images is a line in a poem. And as for journeys, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Richard Long's work. This is a piece he did, a line made by walking in the Andes. Each of us is on a path. Each of us creates our own path. And somehow Richard Long's many, many pieces about these processes of engaging deeply in the world around us seem to be valuable. You know, the colonized mind for me started when I was an art student getting a fine arts degree, and had this belief that being a sculptor would meant that I would make objects for the halls and walls of primarily white rich people. They would be the ones who could afford to come to the galleries and buy my work. And so this colonization began that as a creator I was a sculptor. And this colonization still happens in art schools where you're a painter, you're a dancer, you're a photographer. You're not seen as a creator. And some of the work that Margaret is doing here, this brilliant work here on the Colorado Plateau and the Colorado Basin, it is remarkable because we're moving, we're having this evolution. This is evidence of evolution. Something I wake up looking for every day is evidence of evolution. That now it's this creative impulse that is what we're driven to do. And if we let this porosity happen in our lives, if we let this porosity be, so that we are not colonized to be just one thing, but is this creative impulse that we have, I think that it loosens the boundaries, and we actually can creatively breathe. I want you to just grab that piece for a minute. I've been grappling with questions all my life. I've been grappling with questions about who am I, where am I in the universe, and this particular piece is one that I did many, many years ago. And it's a piece that it's a lawnmower handle, basically. I put a hole in the ground very deep, anchored it deeply so that it couldn't move. And on moonlit evenings, I would ride the planet through the cosmos. Just me on this deep, gorgeous blue planet, just me riding the planet through the cosmos. And these are what Marcel Duchamp called pataphysics, irrational solutions to irrational problems. And once again, as I was going through my life as sculptor, I was doing the gallery work. I was I was not clear at the time that I did this. This is a one-person show I did in Salt Lake City. This piece in the front of the room is actually a toolmaker's bench for an urban planner. The pieces that are behind it are homes, which were called Homes for the Here and Now. They're based after some work done in the southern part of Mexico that are for burial. You would bury someone with a home so they'd have a life in the hereafter. But I was a single dad at the time, and I was trying to provide homes for my kids, solid homes for my kids. So I made all these pieces where the homes for the here and now. But when that planner piece was in front of all these homes, as you noticed, they were laid out in a grid, almost like they were blocks of a city. I didn't know what I was doing. This was a purely unconscious function. But in order to make those things, I had to have a place to live and to work that I could afford. And so going back a while, I found this old building. I found this building. It was built in 1910 by a prominent Utah family to get farmers off of Main Street. None of my studios had had heat or running water, and it was about time that I was living in the 20th century. So I set out and created a nonprofit organization that created live workspace for artists, and it was called Art Space. It's not the art space you know. We all incorporated about the same time, about 1978, 1979. There were 3 artists doing this work in my city, myself and 2 others who were desperately in need of affordable living and workspace. And we had to find a place in the city that we could afford, a place that we could gradually, without knowing it, turn into our living and workspace. We had to do this with our bare hands. We literally had $50 when we started this. No banks would talk to us. We had to find ways to acquire materials. We had to find ways to understand what planning and zoning was. We had to find a way to make it legal to do this, because you couldn't do this legally in our city. So with my friend, we did the seismic reinforcement, and we created beautiful spaces like this. That, by the way, just to draw back to Colorado, that's my oldest son, Ben, who's now 35. And last fall, at the Telluride Film Festival, a film that he did working with Natalie Portman named Eating Animals premiered and was purchased by Sundance, and it'll be around the country this summer. So I keep looking at that face. What was he thinking? What was he imagining? And we created lots of spaces in this particular building, 23 living spaces, all $400 a month at a time, lots of studio spaces, lots of incubator spaces for all kinds of nonprofit organizations. Even the American Institute of Architects moved their office in there. Art Access, not unlike the one you have here in Colorado, was there. The Arts Festival, all of these interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary groups, even a Buddhist temple, found a space where they couldn't otherwise find a space to be in our building. We had gallery space. And in the back of the building, you saw how we didn't even have flies back there when we acquired that building. We began working with heads of households from the homeless shelter, which was 1 block west. We had, sadly, displaced some homeless men from the back of our building when we moved in. We didn't ask them to leave, but just merely by our presence, they decided to move on. Something which we regretted. We understand that housing was a need for everybody, but we began to hire them to help us turn the back of the building into urban gardens. And in the process of doing this, we created public space, spaces that later, in this highest poverty rate in the state, lowest incomes in the state, most violence in the state, we had people calling us, can we get married back there? Can we have a retirement party back there? So all of this creative process was emerging. Again, we got outside of the boundaries. We were no longer just artists in our studios. We were artists in the city, artists as city builders. By listening, and listening with an empathic response, we found that many of the men who would be knocking on our doors at night or in the mornings, who were chronically mentally ill, homeless on the streets, just wanted a place to be, and we didn't have a place for them to be. But I did have a key to a building behind my building that the city was land banking. It had a toilet, and it had a heater. And I said to these gentlemen, there's about 15 of them, not all men, said to them, if you come get the key every morning, you're welcome to go in there. You can stay out of the rain, you can be warm, and you can do what you're describing. You can make your poetry, you can make your paintings, you can do whatever kind of creative work you want to do. And at the end of the day, just bring me the key. They called themselves the Crippled Quill. The experience with these men who on a Christmas Eve knocked on my door with a box of paintings and pages of poetry to give to me, because all I had done was give them a key to a building to stay warm. And we think of that evolutionary impulse and our ability to be creatively responding, compassionately, empathically responding. That's the work we do. That's the work that Danielle just told us about. So when the city found out this was going on, within 1 week, they bulldozed the building. On the side of our building is a mural that depicted artists as city builders. It was done by a Peruvian artist named Pruco Copacati. You can see in that box where it is. You can also see on the right side, another building, the number of people who wanted to have living and workspace in our neighborhood was extraordinary. We had 300 families that wanted to live in the highest poverty rate, highest crime block in the city. And we still were trying to find capital to do this. There were no banks that would loan us money. I think many of you understand what that's like. Just want to point out that in that square box, that mural, as of last week, is gone, because an 8-story building is being built in front of it. So that's the building. Old cold storage warehouse, very, very dark. We began to open it up, create that porosity, open it up. Sort of an Edward Hopper painting in the background with the train station. Reframe the landscape. You can see our Pierpont building, the first one we had done in the background, and create an incredible living space. And one of the things by creating this living space that was so important to us is that we knew that the gentry would be coming, the gentrification is going to be a part of this neighborhood. We wanted to control that as best we possibly could. So we created codes, covenants, and restrictions for this property that means that it will have to stay affordable by federal guidelines until 2095, 100 years. And we did that in all of our projects. We made room for all kinds of creators. This is a gentleman named Michael Moonbird. He came to us on welfare. He had been living in an abandoned building not far away. He said, I just need a place to create. I'm an artist, and I want to teach other kids how to be artists. And he created an organization called Bad Dog Rediscovers America. We helped him put together a business plan. Business plan worked just fine. Back in those days, there was a program called From Welfare to Work. He won the Welfare to Work Award. He was flown to Washington and got a presentation by the Department of Commerce. He now has 10 full-time employees, and he works in another art space building. Also in our building, we made room for, it was about inclusion. It was all about inclusion. It was never about segregation, segregating the painters and the sculptors. It was always about inclusion. The woman on the right lived in our Art Space Rubber Company building, and she was a remarkable, brave woman who just wanted to be a part of the community. So she worked in the coffee shop. She helped roast coffee. She worked with a graphic artist to help her package her materials they would be sending off. She was a part of the creative community. So there's that day when we had our wall breaking. We don't do ground breakings for adaptive reuse. We just do wall breakings. And there's that building that was scheduled to be torn down. The same architect did that building as at our state capitol, but it was going to be torn down. So some of the work we do is to preserve and to conserve as a part of healing and repairing the places that we care about. We also did new buildings. This was the last one that I did when I was the executive director of Art Space, and we made room in terms of inclusion for women coming out of incarceration, coming out of prison who wanted to get their children back. We had we had multiple floors of the building. There was one unit, not labeled, this person was a prisoner. We allowed them, we worked with Catholic Community Services, so they'd have a place to reestablish themselves and get their children back. So those are the buildings. So on that map, from that one black and white photo you saw of the building built in 1910, those are the buildings that this creative community did to heal and repair the most underserved, blighted neighborhood in the state of Utah. So then I moved outside of the studio. I began to move outside. This is a studio without walls, and I was invited to do pieces like this one, which was, along the range of the Wasatch Range of the Rockies. We have mountains that hold 7 canyons. These 7 canyons have 7 creeks that make their way to become a river, and on their way to becoming a river, they find themselves in a confluence, and then after the confluence, they flow to be a Dead Sea, which is the Great Salt Lake. But few people really understand the hydrology of the high mountain desert west. So this 20,000 square foot water feature is sort of a Lilliputian diorama, if you will. I'm going to come back to these lights, just remember those lights. But again, places for people. Places to be in the water, to touch the water, to experience the water, to stay cool in the summer. Kids who don't have access to a swimming pool. Again, it's all about places for people. It's about inclusion. Places to understand the materiality of space. Each one of the rocks was actually brought from the 7 canyons. The piece on the right, by the way, as you can see, I'm trying to tie it into the Wasatch, trying to get that landscape to blend in with the landscape. It was because of this piece that I was denied a teaching position at a university. They said, Mr. Goldsmith, we can't tell where your work ends and the landscape begins. It was the nicest compliment I could have had, but I didn't get the job. Healing and repairing. So I was invited to be, again, my life has been such a life of privilege. I've been able to work on fantastic projects. City acquired this piece of land, a parking lot that was on top of one of those creeks called City Creek. And they wanted to turn it into a public park, and it continues all the way up for about a half a mile into the canyon. And I said I'd be delighted to work on this. I was with Jan Streifel and a brilliant, the Georgia O'Keeffe of landscape architects in the West. And all the auto guano that comes off of those automobiles finds its way into the storm drains, back into those creeks as it makes its way down to a river to become a Dead Sea. The kind of place that needs our creative responses to heal and repair. And that's what we did. We created habitat. We didn't go to the zoo and find ducks. Ducks found us. We worked so closely to find what are the tools and the materials, what are the plants that they need, how can they come back there, and now the place seasonally has its ducks. And it also has lots of other people who have found it as well. It is a place of inclusion. It's a place where many of the protests in our city actually start as they make their way up to the Capitol, which is 2 blocks away. Creative responses. The idea of the Seven Canyons fountain made its way now into a nonprofit organization which is called the Seven Canyons Trust. It's a 100-year plan to daylight those 7 canyon creeks, 27 miles of which are buried underground. How do we get them back up to the light of day? The students that I was working with who have done this have raised already $1.5 million to create the first park in one of the most underserved neighborhoods on the west side of our community, inclusion. And now we include the water in the inclusion. At a children's hospital, had the privilege of making a water feature and working with a brilliant risk management office. Imagine at a children's hospital, convincing risk managers to allow us to design the walls of a water feature so shallow that would allow children to come in their wheelchairs to be in the water. To find that connection with the single most important thing we have on our planet, which is our water. That's when we find that our collaborative roles, our collaborative skills can come to roost in the most beautiful and unexpected ways. In the destruction that is around us often, one of the things that disturbs us who are pack rats, sculptors are often pack rats, and we gather everything we can find. When we see wasted material, we say, oh, I'm going to take that, I'll put it in my studio, I'll get a storage unit, it's a beautiful timber, it's whatever, we do that. If you know artists and you've seen their spaces, we harvest everything. So that same landscape architect, myself, a musician, and the Poet Laureate of the United States were invited to do a temporary park in Salt Lake City. We had a very large budget from the redevelopment agency to buy new materials, and we said, how can we possibly do that? What kind of an ethic would it be to buy new materials for a temporary park? You're planning on building new buildings here in preparation for the Olympics and other things. How could we in good conscience do that? We'll just use the materials that you're tearing down. So we made these we made these places for people with the materials that we found. And in understanding this, again, this constant path of observation, this constant path of discovery, led to a project which is called the Temporary Museum of Permanent Change. The Temporary Museum of Permanent Change was a response to more destruction that was going on to make way for a gigantic 20-acre development of an interior of a big mall, fortunately with some mixed use, but still they were tearing things down. The city was changing, and I was prompted by this because the person who was in charge of the project said, well, Mr. Goldsmith, when the city is done, I said, when the city is done. Even Chernobyl is not done. Every place is always changing. It's the systolic, diastolic response in cities. So all cities are our museums of change. We made these downloadable tickets that people could download, print on their computer, and they could go into stores and get a 10% discount because that was the museum shop or the museum restaurant or the museum store. All of these were catalysts for understanding the creativity of the community that was at hand. And that's the mayor at the opening of the Temporary Museum Permanent Change. And if we can just have a cone of silence in this room, just a cone of silence, promise not to tell anybody. So those frames, which were installed more than 10 years ago, are still there. I work with another creative organization called Craft Lake City. We every month curate the streets, and this is hundreds and hundreds of feet of space, and nobody asks us any questions. Don't tell anybody. We're constantly installing artwork, and nobody asks us any questions. Shh. So as you may know, I was the city's planning director during the 2002 Olympic Games. And I was the first artist planner in the United States to do this work. So wait a minute. I'm a sculptor. I've decolonized that. I'm an affordable housing developer. I've decolonized that. I've had to work with all kinds of planning and zoning issues in order to make it legal to have live workspace in the city. And now the mayor is calling and saying if I'd be the planning director. So I said to a colleague of mine in Boston, I said, I'm being asked to be a planning director. I've done the work. I have, a master's degree just by virtue of the fact that I've been doing this, but should I take the work? And he asked me if I knew the work of Jane Jacobs, and I don't know how many of you know the work of Jane Jacobs. And he said, well, that's all you need. Just need to know how to observe and how to respond and how to create. Don't let the previous planning processes colonize your mind, and see what you can do. So one of the things we did is we created an exhibition during the Olympics called The Physical Fitness of Cities, Vision and Ethics in City Building. And it was an 8-week sort of Academy Awards for some of the finest work being done around the country. We found those creators from around the world doing the best bridges, the best affordable housing, the best bikeways, anything that had to do with the built environment, that interfaced with the natural environment and people. And we did a 2-week exhibition during the Olympics as part of the Cultural Olympiad about vision and ethics. It's the creative responses. It's the path that all of us are on. And if we get out of the colonization and allow ourselves to step into these arenas, these are the things that I believe we can all be doing. As part of this work, after we put together the Center for the Living City, which I did with Jane Jacobs prior to her death, again, I've told you I've had a very privileged life. We put together the Center for the Living City, whose purpose it is to look at the complexity of human settlements and how do we change the ecology of these places. So I went with a bunch of students from SUNY Purchase College to New Orleans not long after Katrina. You remember when I talked about all of the wasted material? Mile after mile after mile. I don't know how many of you might have been there during this time, but it's mile after mile after mile, and this material is being put in barges by people who are not from New Orleans, not employed by the city of New Orleans, people employed by other large multinational corporations who came in and made a lot of money on destruction. And this material was thrown into the Gulf of Mexico. So the creative response was, we can't do that. I mean, some of this is cypress wood that's 200 years old. Some of this was barge board that came down the Mississippi. It's oak planks that are 36 inches wide and 2 inches deep. As a sculptor, as a craftsman, as a furniture maker, and we cannot let this happen. So we put together the Carina Furniture Project. The idea was to hire, train, and employ people from New Orleans to take that raised by the trade notion, which has been New Orleans. The craftsmen of New Orleans were laborers during the day often and musicians at night. We brought students into Tulane University, which was pretty much abandoned because of the floods. These were students from Austin. They began to do prototypes. Because one of the things we discovered was 1,000 churches had been destroyed during Katrina and they needed pews. So could that material, which now had embodied story, not just embodied energy, but embodied story, could it be put back in those churches? Could people be sitting on that wood that was going into the Gulf of Mexico as a way to have that embodied wisdom as a part of the work? It's about observation. And Jane Jacobs' work was all about observation. That was the scientific method. Not what planners thought, not what architects thought, but how did cities really work? How do human beings really function on the streets of their city? So we've created a new program which is called the Observe Program. It's a project for amplifying the voices of young women around the world by having them go into the places that they love and observe those places. Just observe them. How does it feel? What does it look like? What does it smell like? Are there places that are scary? Are there places that have an opportunity? Are there people who are lonely? So by using their powers of observation, they can have that creative response, and then we give them the tools and techniques to do this. We just hired a Jane Jacobs Fellow in Chennai. She's doing this all over India right now. We've had students who have actually gone to Pakistan doing work with other students there. The creative response, that's that evolutionary impulse that we have. That's the work that you do. And the pilot was the Muslim Girl Scouts of Utah. You know, there are patterns here, there are patterns, and if we listen to nature, if nature is what informs this work, and if we acknowledge that we are nature, this binary we have of natural, unnatural, it's a ridiculous binary, that nature is something other than us. We are nature, and if we allow ourselves to respond to the world around us in that way, I mean, these roots found their way to water. Men put these in the way, and they found their way to water. It's that evolutionary impulse. I want to survive. I want to thrive. So I'm going to switch to the end of my my comments here, and just want to do a couple other things. a couple other things. Working with students at the University of Utah who are trying to change the amount of power being used in the dormitories, wanted to get students to turn off their lights. I mean, there's just so much wasted energy in the dormitory. So we came up with this project. It's called Impact Images, and the idea was that if we replace the switch plates, so that students put an image in there that reminded them to remember to turn off the lights. Not to turn off your lights like you put on your kids' rooms or put on your rooms, right? We don't do things if it's this. We do things if we connect and if we attach. So we went through a long, long process to get the permission to do this. And so this is a particular image that was used because this is not where the electricity comes from. So if you follow that electricity all the way back through those wires to the place where the box is attached to the building, and then to the transformer stations in the neighborhood, and then to the power plant, and then to those men and women who are underground risking their lives every day to bring that privilege to you, maybe you'll be reminded to remember to turn them off because you're connecting to the people who do this work. Our privilege is born on the backs of so many people. So the Impact Image project is one more creative response to a little challenge in a big institution. So you remember I told you to keep your eyes on those lights on the Seven Canyons fountain? I am so disgusted at what we did by installing those lights, because we were not thinking about this. We contribute to this, which is sky glow. And those of us who understand the privilege we have of being here in these high mountain deserts, no place in the developed world has more access to the dark sky than we do on the Colorado Plateau, and you all understand that. Because most people haven't seen this. And if one of the crises of our time is a crisis of imagination, we need to be able to see this. We have to understand our place in the cosmos, that we are just dust. Each of us, that's all we are. And understand our responsibility while we're here on this blue planet. So we can't lose this. So one of the projects that I'm finishing with right now is the Consortium for Dark Sky Studies. I'm the co-director of a new initiative. It's a center at the university that looks at artificial light at night, the health problems associated with artificial light at night, the safety, and all those other things that are associated. And I don't know if many of you are doing astrotourism work here in Colorado, but we're doing it a lot. We have a cooperative, a dark sky cooperative. It's part of our work, and we'd love to work with you. Any of you in the room who are working in areas where astrotourism is a part of your work, contact me afterwards. I'd love to talk to you about some opportunities, creative opportunities, to make this a sustainable part of our work. We're all adapting. We have to adapt. Fortunately, being at the sea level, being this high above sea level, we don't have to worry too much about this. But this was an adaptation project that I found when I was in the Netherlands. a few years ago, because they really have to be paying attention to this. This was an entire store of climate change appropriate clothing. And on Saturday, I head to the Netherlands to install a water museum, because that's just my path, and I thank you.